Have you ever had one of those moments where afterwards you think, why did I say that? Why didn't I say what I actually meant? Why did I say yes when I knew I didn't want to?
Or where am I still thinking about this hours later when the other person has moved on, had dinner, watched TV, gone to sleep, having a great time, and I'm still replaying the same old tune?
Exactly. Still replaying it like there's going to be a different ending. And I think that's what we want to talk about on this podcast. Those moments. The ones where they seem small on the outside, but they feel really big on the inside. The message that makes your stomach drop. The tone that makes you really defensive. Or the silence that just makes you panic. Or maybe it's that comment that suddenly makes you feel like a younger version of yourself. The moment where you think, I don't want to react like this, but somehow that old pattern has already started. Welcome to the One Moment Rule podcast with Rita and Vanita.
And we're really happy you're here. I think the reason this podcast matters to us is because so many people are walking around thinking they're the problem. And honestly, they're not. They think they're too sensitive, too emotional, too difficult, too much, or not confident enough. But a lot of the time, what's really happening is that pattern underneath, that unconscious pattern, something learned, something repeated, something that probably made sense at some point, even if it doesn't help anymore.
And we're not coming into this as two people who have everything perfectly worked out.
Definitely not.
Definitely not. I mean, the truth is, the one moment rule didn't come from us just sitting down one day, having a cup of tea, trying to create this neat little framework. It came from real life, from really, really low points. Moments where we just felt really overwhelmed, stuck, and to be honest, at times a bit broken by the same patterns repeating. You know, those same reactions, the same guilt, the same overthinking, the same of, feeling like, why am I here again? And I think when you hit those points, you start asking different questions. Not those polished questions, but those really honest ones. Like, what is actually happening here? And why do I keep going back to the same response? Why do I feel like I know better, but I can't do better in the moment?
And that's really where pause, choose, shift started for us, at the time when we were completely broken. Not as a slogan, not as something we wanted to sound clever, but as something we needed.
And a way to catch ourselves in that one moment before the pattern took over completely.
Yes, because sometimes you don't need someone to give you a long lecture. You need something you can remember in that moment. You know, when your chest is tight, when your mind is racing, when the guilt has come in before your own needs, when you're about to say yes, apologise, shut down, snap, or explain yourself for the 10th time. That's where pause, choose, shift came from. It was our way of saying, can I pause long enough to notice what is happening? Can I choose something that supports me instead of just repeating what I know? Can I shift the response even slightly? And we're still practicing it again and again at this very moment. We're coming into this as a mother and daughter who have had a lot of conversations about emotions, reactions, family patterns, people-pleasing, boundaries, guilt, self-trust, all of it, everything.
And some of those conversations have been lovely and some have been really uncomfortable. Some probably started with one of us saying, no, but that's not what I meant.
Usually.
I mean, but that's real life. That's where learning happens. Not in like a perfect quote on Instagram that you see type way, and not pretending that we always respond calmly, but in that moment where you notice, oh, hang on a second, why did that affect me so much?
And that is really the aim of this podcast, to help people understand why things happen, why we react, why we shut down, why we over-explain, why we feel guilty for saying no, why we keep the peace and then feel resentful later, why we know that we should do, but when the moment comes, something just takes over us. Because when you don't understand the why, it's very easy to shame yourself. You say, I'm doing it again, I'm being ridiculous, I should be over this by now. But when you start to understand where a pattern came from, you can relate to yourself differently.
And that's the bit I really care about, because I think a lot of people are tired of just being told what to do. Oh, just set the boundary, just stop caring, don't let it get to you. And it's like, okay, that's lovely, but how exactly do I do that?
Exactly.
Because in the actual moment, it doesn't feel that simple. You might know you need a boundary, but your guilt comes in first. You might know you shouldn't send a long message, but your anxiety has already drafted 3 versions of it. And you might know you're allowed to say no, but your body's acting like you've done something so terrible. And that's the part we want to talk about. The real bit, the messy bit, the bit before the advice.
And because we're mother and daughter, you'll hear from both of us. Both our perspectives. Sometimes we'll agree, sometimes we won't. Sometimes we'll probably debate something because we see it differently.
And sometimes Mum will say something like, I think I need a minute with that.
And sometimes Vanita will say something and I'll think the same.
Exactly. But I think that's important because emotional patterns don't always have one neat answer. We always see things through our own experiences, our age or our relationships, our responsibilities and what we've been through and what we've had to learn through life. And sometimes hearing a different perspective makes you question your own pattern, but in a good way. So not in a shaming way, just in like I've never thought of it like that before kind of way.
We also want this to feel like a real conversation. We are not here to lecture. It is not a lesson. Not us sitting here pretending to have all the answers. Because honestly, we don't. We're still learning too. But we do care deeply about helping people feel less alone in the things they quietly struggle with. The overthinking, the guilt, the emotional responsibility, the fear of disappointing people, the feeling that you have to be the strong one, the habit of saying, it's fine, when it really isn't fine.
And the funny thing is, these things don't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's not some huge life-changing moment. Sometimes it's you saying yes to something, but then you're annoyed about it for the rest of the day.
Or writing a message, deleting it, writing it again, making it softer, adding a smiley face, then still worrying you sounded rude.
That is actually painfully accurate.
It is.
And that's what we mean by patterns. They're not always big and obvious. Sometimes they're just the tiny ways we abandon ourselves, the way we soften what we really mean, the way we take responsibility for everyone else's mood, the way we stay quiet because speaking up feels really risky, the way we call something keeping the peace when we're actually just losing our own.
And we want to say this clearly. Having those unconscious patterns doesn't mean you're broken. It just means you adapted. It means you learned a way to get through something. You survived. Maybe you learned to be easy. Maybe you learned to be helpful. Maybe you learned not to make a fuss. Maybe you learned to stay one step ahead of other people's reactions. And maybe that helped you at that time. But at some point, the thing that helped you cope can start costing you something. Your peace, your voice, your confidence, your boundaries, your ability to trust yourself. And that's when it becomes important to understand it.
And that's what the 1 moment rule is really about for us. It's that moment where you catch the pattern, not perfectly, not every time, but even just once. That moment where you think, wait, I know this feeling, I know this urge, and I know what I normally do here. But this time, you maybe try something different. Not a huge transformation, not a completely new personality by next week Tuesday.
But I won't lie, that would be nice though.
Oh, it would be convenient. But real change is usually smaller than that. It's one pause, one honest thought, one different response, and one moment where you don't abandon yourself quite as quickly. And those are the moments that matter.
So if you've ever wondered why you keep reacting in the same way, if you've ever felt guilty of having needs, if you ever thought, I know I want to change this, but I don't know where to start, then this podcast is for you.
And this is the 1 Moment Rule podcast, a podcast about real life emotional patterns, why they happen, and the moment where something can begin to shift. We're not here to shame the pattern, we're here to understand it. And in our first episode, we're starting with the question behind so many of those moments. Why do we keep repeating patterns we know aren't helping us?
Why do we go back to what's familiar, even when part of us wants something different?
That's what we're talking about next. Welcome to the 1 Moment Rule podcast.